Okay, so today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start having a conversation about female-only spaces and specifically lesbian spaces. But the two kind of go hand in hand. Usually where there's female only, there's more lesbians. It's the way it rolls. Um, this probably will likely be several videos exploring different aspects of the history, the present, um, other lesbians' experiences with female-only spaces or the lack thereof. There is going to be some conversation around trans ideology and kind of the I want to say the infiltration of that, but if you want to put it more nicely, you could say, something else. I guess I'm not even going to try. I feel like it's infiltrated. I'm just going to be honest. Um, I have been thinking about female spaces, lesbian only spaces for years now, actually. I stopped taking testosterone and re-identified as a woman about 4 years ago now. And from the moment I decided to stop and the moment I decided that to be honest and just understand that I'm just a lesbian, I really felt like I needed to find other lesbians. I needed to find lesbian community. Felt like I needed that support. And so I went back to my local area. I looked at Facebook, our local website for LGBT news and spaces, and um, I didn't find anything, actually. I didn't find anything that was lesbian specific. I found kind of maybe one group, kind of, but they'd been inactive for a long time. Didn't look like they were doing much, but I looked at Meetup everywhere I could see support groups, nothing was lesbian. The what I did see was a whole lot of gender and trans support groups and social groups, and it really seemed like trans had taken over the whole conversation. So that left me really feeling lost. And so I ended up just kind of searching online, and I found other lesbians, other detransition women. Um, and fast forward 4 years later, I still don't have like a community where I live necessarily, but I have a pretty strong community connection online, and those online connections have led to me being able to go to lesbian only events and meetups and stuff like that. So I have had in-person support. And I have found it immensely healing. I cannot tell you how healing it is, as a woman, to have female-centered female spaces, um, and as a lesbian to have lesbian-specific spaces. Incredibly important. So, with all that in mind, with that in mind, I come to this asking, why don't we have these spaces necessarily like we used to? Where are these spaces? What's going on here? And I decided to start by talking about the big one, which was Michfest. Even as a young lesbian, I heard about Michfest. I didn't know much of anything about it. My idea of what Michfest was back in my early 20s was that it was some hippy dippy nonsense that old lesbians went to, lesbians my mom's age, which, you don't want anything to do with when you're super cool and you're 21 or whatever. um, that's all I pretty much knew about it. And then fast forward to kind of like now, and I start asking, I look at some of the stories, and I've listened to some of the stories from other lesbians about their experience at Michfest and stuff like that. And I'm just like, wow, it's not at all what I thought it was. And what an immensely incredible place. The least of which it was a music festival. That's the least of what it was from the information I've gathered. It really was a kind of little island of a community and culture all of its own, that was female centered. And it's gone now. That particular festival shut down, and there's a lot of rumors, and stories and everything that floats around everywhere that the common belief, I think, among most people, most lesbians and most women, and I've heard this too, and I believed it or believe it to a certain extent, but like I'm trying to figure this out too, and try to know the truth, because I think if we understand the truth behind something, we can better be resilient against maybe losing our spaces in the future or retaining them or building them again. So one of the common misconceptions I've heard a lot is that that Michfest wouldn't let trans people in, and so the trans community boycotted and got a lot of groups to boycott Michfest, and that ended up closing Michfest. That's not, from what I see and read, not entirely true. Before I ramble on anymore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the source, and I'm going to read an article or an interview that was done by After Ellen. I would encourage you all to go support After Ellen. I will post the link to the article. Read it yourself. They're one of the few publications that have stood fast and retained a woman only space, at least for online, publications and what have you. All right, so let me pull up the interview here. This is called "Setting the Record Straight About Michfest" by Jocelyn McDonald. And this was published in October 24th, 2018. The Michigan Women's Music Festival operated an intentional community for women in the woods starting in 1976. During this time, the festival became legendary in the lesbian community, but now, wherever you read about it online, even from sources supportive of women-only spaces and of founder Lisa Vogel, you are likely to encounter, at best, unmalicious but ultimately harmful inaccuracies, and at worst, distortions, lies, and probably libelous nonsense. We sat down with Michfest founder Lisa Vogel to set the record straight. In her own words, about the attention women-born women's space and why Michfest ended after 40 years. Okay, so here we go. After Ellen. What was the intention of Michfest and how did it develop? Lisa Vogel. Well, how it actually started, and this isn't really discussed a lot, when we began the festival in 1976, there really wasn't much of a presence of the trans community, but there was, for the first time, an interracial community of dykes living together in Michigan. It was women only, and we, as producers and organizers, and I say that lightly because we were so new at everything, would have women come up to us and say, there's a man on the land, and we'd go over and it would be a bearded woman. Or we'd walk over to check it out, and really often it would be a butch Black woman. And white women were not used to being around a diversity of Black women. So much so that when I was approached, my first question would be, what is the person's skin color? And then if they said Black, I wouldn't even bother taking it any further. I just say, sister, I think you need to check yourself. Our intention of never questioning anyone's gender on the land stemmed from that. And that was in the 70s, before anyone was really discussing gender identity. It was really clear that here we are, we have this women-only space, and women are getting confused. They didn't know butch women, or bearded women, or Black women, then they were IDing sisters as men. And so really, our original focus on this started out as, we don't want here to be any place where a woman is questioned, because we're questioned about our womanhood all the time. I mean, I'm a butch woman. I've been questioned, so that was the foundation of it. And then we rolled into the 80s and the very beginning of the appearance of more trans folks in the community. Then people would start to come up and say, there's a trans person on the land. And we'd go, look, we don't question anybody about who they are. We would rather have everybody here than have a single woman be questioned. In the late 70s, early 80s, we came up with the term women-born women. Our first kind of tag as a festival was a gathering for mothers and daughters, and that evolved into a gathering of mothers and daughters for women-born women. Since Michigan was around for a long time, the politics of everything shifted over those 40 years. We later clarified that woman born woman, um, this is for women who were born and survived girlhood and still identify as women. And we always added that we leave um, the onus on each individual to respond to that as they will. And as is well known, once in 1991, there was a trans woman who was asked to leave the land. I wasn't directly involved with that moment, but I take responsibility. I know the circumstances of it. And that was the only time a trans person was questioned or asked to leave by the festival. We read the accounts of it, and in anyone's memory from the festival, it's not really how it happened. We actually put her up in a hotel, the same hotel that we put the artist up in. It was told in a very intense way that didn't match what happened. I know the woman who was doing security, who handled it, and she, at the time, didn't even agree about having it women-born women space. But some women at the gate were bugging out about this woman's presence, this trans woman's presence. And one thing led to another. From that point on, that moment in 1991, Michigan was an organizing tool for the trans community. No one was interested in listening to what we were really about. The first year that Camp Trans happened, Camp Trans was across the road. I got a call from the box office and they said, "Hey, a bunch of people from Camp Trans are coming over. What should we do?" And I said, just check in with them and say, "We want you to understand the intention of this festival is for women born women, and the onus is on you to decide what to do with that." And they said, "And then what should we do?" And I said, "Then if they want to buy a ticket, you sell them a ticket." And then everybody from Camp Trans came in. My partner of 20 years was in that group that came across the road. So I know firsthand from her too. Now, that part of the story is never told. No one says they didn't stop us from coming in. No one bothers to mention that. I assume you've read some of the festival statements. We've gone to great pains to say what our position is. And our position is, we do not question anyone's gender. We are well aware that trans women and trans men attend the event, and they attend as supporters, not detractors, of the female-centered space. But the people who have most deeply criticized this have no idea what the festival is really about. They have no idea about the radical feminist space we created together. The intention that was meaningful to us did not translate into a policy of policing people. Michigan became a tool that trans activists and gay activists could wield against a larger homophobic mainstream culture. They could say, "This is an example of intolerance even in our own community." Gay men don't come from a radical lesbian analysis, so they don't understand why we believe what we believe. After Ellen, how did people who were never a part of the festival or the lesbian community co-opt it for their own agenda? Lisa, the press covered Camp Trans wildly, and I would try to respond. The betrayal was in a way that is straight up misogyny by the gay press and the straight press. We cannot forget how defensive everybody is about having women's spaces. It was kind of perfect for the straight press and the gay press to have someone hammering us about having exclusive space that was supposedly from within the community. All kinds of things happen within the gay male community that is exclusive of trans people, that is exclusive of women, that is exclusive of, for example, anyone except bears. They have complete autonomy of whoever they want to include. It's frustrating that this exclusivity is only held against women. I think it was used as a tool by the all of a sudden exploding trans community to be pitted against these nasty lesbian separatists. You've been to Michigan. It's made up of everybody, just everybody. But they overlooked the radically inclusive community because they don't care about the radical gender expression of women. Michigan was the most radically diverse group of women that you could find in one space, more than San Francisco, Portland, Brooklyn, Toronto. I mean, you just never saw as diverse of a group of women. And I really learned a lot in the last couple of years when so many gay and lesbian organizations signed on to the Equality Michigan protest and boycotted the festival. Their fundraising focus, now that gay marriage is done, their best fundraising tool is their sharp focus on trans liberation. There's a ton of money, there's a tremendous amount of legislative support. There are very deep pockets. There's a lot of controversy in my mind. There's a lot of controversy in my mind about where that money is coming from. The medical industrial complex, the many wealthy trans women in tech and finance, the organizations, I was told off the record by more than one, we can't take our name off of that petition because that will affect how we look, and that endangers our funding. They signed up for this petition and made these type of comments so they could be on the right side of the issue, because there's also a very aggressive element in the trans radical community that attacks and goes for blood on anyone who doesn't agree with their essential premise. And their essential premise is very focused on trans women and never on trans men. That very one-sided focus is also something no one wants to tease out. None of these organizations wanted anyone to focus on them. Women who left the fest and got mad that these orgs had signed this petition, and women who hadn't even been to the fest in 20 years started pulling their donations to the LGBT orgs. Some of these donations were big, and the pushback came from Dykes. And the pushback from Dykes was pretty significant. No one could actually hold in their head that these organizations were signing on to boycott a lesbian space. These organizations came to me and wanted to apologize and make nice, and I said, take your name off the petition. They made it clear that even though they would say to me that they wish they hadn't signed it, they weren't going to take their names off the petition. I mean, everyone is running afraid of someone who's sitting in Sunnyvale behind a computer ready to attack them. It's given a small group of people a lot of power. The reality is that Michigan already did not have the support of the gay community, and we were an embarrassment to the gay organizations. We were all trying to be who were all trying to be mainstream, and we were not trying to be mainstream. We were trying to live a different ethic and a different politic. No, we won't fly an HRC flag. No, we won't do that. After Ellen. I wonder how festival goers received Camp Trans. Did women share their reactions to Camp Trans with you? Lisa, I think people were all over the board. The festival community is not a monolith, and nothing about the festival community demanded a certain adherence to a particular point of view to be whole within the community. To the contrary, we felt like in order to have the kind of community that we wanted to work more to understand differences, be willing to live with the tension of differences. So stating our intention was for this to be a space for women-born women. There was a fair number of women who disagreed with that. There were a larger group who agreed with it, and the largest group of all could care less either way, or maybe not that they couldn't care less, but that they didn't engage in it. They were at a festival, and unless something bad happened to them, they were good. They were happy. After Ellen, my experience at Fest was exactly as you were saying. An incredible diversity of background and experience. I only saw it from the perspective of an attendee, though. Was there a difference between the workers and the larger festival in terms of the beliefs about the intention? Lisa, I would say the women who really wanted the fest to be women-born women's space, without trans women, would say everybody wanted that, or most people want that. And women who wanted trans women welcomed and sought after would say the majority wanted that too. I don't find that longtime workers were different from the rest of the fest, but there was a real passionate variety of points of view on the crew. Another myth of support for the intention is around age. I personally know many young women who were serious about women-born women's space. And I know women in their 70s arguing for a welcome to trans women. I don't know if you made it to an Allies and Understanding workshops. I only made it to one. It was the only workshop I actually went to in 40 years. I was very moved by witnessing that age diversity in itself, to see the young sisters talking about what it's like, going to women's college and struggling with the college changing its guidelines to self definition. And I saw really elder sisters talking about how trans women are revolutionaries and that this is part of the revolution. So there's not an answer. There's a complex conversation to have. But with the intensity of the attacks on both sides, it's the right wing side or both conversations that's stopping the conversation from happening more deeply and moving forward. There are plenty of sisters who support the festival that scare me a little bit. I don't have personal need to drum up bigotry about a group of people. I have criticisms, but it needs to stay in the realm of criticisms and analysis, or we're going to have more and more problems getting our message across about self-determination and sovereignty. It's a very complicated situation right now where everything is heading. Michigan was really the first event institution attacked systematically. Many other spaces have been closed. After Ellen, people think that the only thing that ended Fest is the question of, is the intention bigoted and can Michfest survive, or is it on the wrong side of history? It was destined to close because of its inherent bigotry. You and other sisters organized a massive fucking city out of the dust for 40 years. And at a certain point, you passed the torch. I don't doubt the magnitude of artists and funders pulling away from Michigan, but I wonder if part of it was letting your baby grow up and go out into the world. Lisa, the truth was, it was a combination of things. I can't deny the pressure and the focus on the festival made producing the event more difficult. I went from being an always more than full-time job to a massive full-time job with a complicated political situation to handle. I can't tease out how much of that was the cause. 40 years of a run of doing anything is long, long time. I started when I was 19 and I was going to turn 60. And I had attempted for the last 15 years to reorganize the festival so I didn't have to work equal to 2 full-time jobs in a year. It was fantastic in my 20s and 30s. It was getting a little hard in my 40s, and in my 50s, it was really fucking hard. And I was unsuccessful at doing that, of making the changes to peel back to a regular job. Some of that was pure finances. There were many things that influenced the attendance of the festival, and certainly the trans debate was one of them. But Michigan was one of the few iconic, steeped in radical feminist organizations that still existed after 40 years, still committed to maintaining the same value system always. A lot of folks may have morphed into something that mimicked the mainstream ways of doing things, and I was never interested to do that. The Michigan community was not about that. I did a mock-up after the 39th festival to look at how to make the fest financially viable after the 40th. What we would have to survive financially, it would have meant cutting so much, essentially cutting all the things we know and love about Michigan that took so much money and people and labor, like having all 3 child care areas, having DART, having not a first aid tent, but a radical exposure to healthcare. All the things we did that held that container, that made us all feel safe, that this is the world we want to be living in. Now, I could have done a music show and stripped out all that stuff, and I imagine some people would have come. But that's not what I wanted to produce. Maybe if I'd done that starting in my 20s, but I had been there for the evolution of this thing. We had all created. Each wave of women had different ideas, and my job was just to facilitate the ideas that came from everybody. And that was why it was so cool. Women did not just come and go. Well, that was cool. They had feedback. I read every single piece of feedback over the years. That was my commitment because I wanted to know. And we would make a list of possible things to work on. But I personally, after experiencing matriarchy and Amazon culture, could not return to doing just a straight up music festival. I'm not dissing anybody who just does a music show, but I couldn't do that there, the land. I was working on looking at all of this right after the Equality Michigan boycott blow up. It made it harder for sure, but it's not the reason. I know everybody likes to say Michigan would rather close than change, and that's true, but not in the way they think. I did not want us to have the experience of disassembling what we built. I wanted us to go out Amazon proud. After Ellen, how you were able to make the space without holding on to how are you able to make the space without holding on to control? You have a vision for your project and it's easy to hold on to that. So how did you allow this to grow and change while letting go of that control? Lisa, I'm well aware of what I gave to the community. I came up with the good ideas myself, but my true work and what I did well was consistently keep myself in check about seeing myself as a trustee. I know I was the owner, but I really saw myself as the trustee of the community. I got into that place with my role kind of early on. Some of it was that phrase, you can either be a good example or a bad example, but you will always be an example. I had some examples of how I didn't want to be, and that was people who wanted to be figureheads and not roll up their sleeves and get into it. People who wanted to take credit for everything, even something that complex. Of course, it's hundreds of women pulling it off. For me, it was a spiritual journey, facilitated quite a bit more when I got sober. I got sober pretty young. I had someone I knew who produced a festival back in the late 70s who looked me in the face and said, "Do you know how much power you have?" I was like, "You scare me. I want a seat at the table. I do not want to be held separate from my friends, my sisters." When you're an organizer for a long time, you actually have to fight for that little bit. You become a figurehead. Weird things happen, like you walk into a circle and people stop talking. You're the it, not the girl. I just feel like it was the thing most important for me to stay rooted in. I'm writing some stories down, and I remember the woman who inspired DART, Disabled Access Resource. I remember the name of the woman who got in our face and pushed us to create services for women with disabilities. I remember the woman who started the Women of Color tent, and so on, and so on, and so on. And in so doing, they changed the culture of Michigan. I can't say I didn't resist some of these changes at first, but the beauty of Michigan was that we all had ownership, and the diversity of Michigan was that we all had ownership. It wasn't a white women's music festival that Black women played music at. Women of color had ownership on the land. And in doing that, it changed the culture of Michigan. So I feel like I'm a working class dyke. I had to work really hard the first 10 years. I did everything. I was on the stage building crew right down to the last year. I always did a couple of Sano shifts cleaning toilets for the workers. I did that because I need to earn my seat. If I'm just pushing a paper and talking on the phone and showing up at meetings, I'm that thing. But if I will go and pull on the tent rope and clean the toilets and do garbage run, that actually includes me. I credit that to being working class and sober and not wanting to be lonely. Annie, or after Ellen, what is it about women only space that allows women to create the future? Lisa, we all live in patriarchy, and patriarchy has gotten a major boost lately. But I feel like we were also dealt a popular lie for a couple of decades that feminism was no longer needed. Smart women said they didn't feel oppressed as women. And that was the most excellently crafted PR campaign that patriarchy launched. And they fucking did it. They had it coming from the mouth of women. So we live in patriarchy. Whether we are aware of it or not, we are not seen. We are not valued. Certainly not the same as men, right down to the antithesis of that. We are loathed and feared. If you get into a space where it's all women, whether it's 10 or 10,000, the defensiveness, the protection, the guards that we live with every day, and we don't know we live with them, fall away, and we start to discover our strength and our beauty and our commonality. In the 70s, we would sit around and discuss how we think in a woman identified way when the only way I've learned to think is male identified. We actually thought about it literally like that. We were aware that we were in patriarchy and that our ways of thinking were patriarchal and capitalistic and anti woman. We used to sit around and think those thoughts and push ourselves very deliberately. But that happens organically in women only space. It just starts to happen. It might be how we consider our appearance. I can't tell you the hundreds of letters I read over the years of women saying, I never felt comfortable with my appearance until Michigan. And that's simply because we saw the diversity of women. And you think she looks great. She looks great. Her crazy outfit looks fantastic. Big women, small women, whatever. But also the burden of being under the male gaze, the patriarchal gaze, the very values that push on us to be something other than strong or open. The essential thing is when we create space with just women, it allows us to appear as our true essential selves, and that strengthens us. People always say, Michigan charges my battery for the next year. That was partly why it was such a hard decision to bring it to a close. It was true for me too. It charged my batteries, it charged my sense of self. And that wasn't about work, that was about living in a community. Women only space, we need it. We need to create it, small or big, to be able to support who we are and certainly for survival in this patriarchy, more than survival, you know. After Ellen, do you have any advice for women forging women-only spaces in these troubling times? Lisa, believe in yourself. That's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do. When I started organizing Michigan, I was 19. I had never organized anything more than a kegger. Don't feel like you have to be perfect. To be of service to your community is a beautiful thing and will enrich your life. Start small and believe in yourself. We're in an instant world right now, right? Wrap your mind around what's going to give you and your sisters the most liberation and try to create it. And there will be women who need it. There will be women who want it. I believe every woman needed Michigan, but it but it's but it wasn't necessarily for women who needed it. It was for women who wanted it. I feel like something about the times we live in puts some pressure on people to come out and have whatever they're doing to be complete when they start, but don't be afraid of failing. Whatever failing is, go forward and create. So yeah, that's the conclusion. I hope my reading wasn't too bad. If I mispronounced a word or two, apologize. But yeah, I would encourage you to go read this too. I think this is a really, this is from Lisa herself. This is what she says, and I find it very interesting. And this is something I didn't know. I didn't know that like their policy had always been not to question anybody's gender, you know, um, or sex. I guess in this sense, they're using gender as the same as sex. So it was, and she tells why, right? And I get it because, as a butch woman, um, I've I've been in many spaces where I've been questioned, um, or been initially thought to be a dude until maybe I spoke or they took a different look at me or maybe I smiled or I don't know something. Um, so it can be. I get it, and that was something I didn't understand, and I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of twisting of the truth seems like was happening here. The other thing too is we tend to really this is just the guy he's just a human trait. We tend to want things to be one way or the other, you know, right versus wrong, black versus white. Like we want things very compartmentalized, and it's hard for us to not be to be to put things in little, their own little boxes. Um, but lesbian community, like she said, it's not a monolith. Like the lesbian community, we don't all agree. Um, this is something I've really come, I think, to start to understand. I'm going to say start to understand. Okay. Michfest, other organization, other like groups, events, spaces like that were women born women, women only kind of spaces, had a very, very solid radical feminist or second wave feminist base to them, women centered. Not every lesbian is a feminist. Not every lesbian is a second waver or a radical feminist. Not every lesbian puts women first. Um, there is, I used to be one, and I known a lot in my life, and probably still know a few. There are many, many a woman who will put a man first, lesbians included. And so I think it's very important to remember that these spaces that I'm thinking of, and even some of the spaces I've been in person recently have had a feminist foundation to them. And I think that's the key here. I think that might be what kind of splits up the groups a bit, and so Michfest had that foundation, had that feminist foundation. It didn't mean you needed to be a feminist to go, right? It was open to all women. Well, it was open to everybody, really, because like she said, she didn't want to question. So I think in talking with an older lesbian who'd actually attended these events, she said something I found very interesting. She said it wasn't so much that it had nothing really to do with it being a women only place, because it really it couldn't be necessarily, because they didn't throw anybody out. Like if a dude showed up, they weren't necessarily going to throw him out, like she said, I don't question people's gender. So it wasn't so much that. It had more to do with the fact that it was female centered, right? It wasn't male centered. And so the men that want to go and be a part of this, they want it to be about them. They want it to be centered on them. And there's many women who will go along with this and want it to be centered on them too. And I think this is my take, this is my opinion. I think that's where some of that split happens, wanting to center women versus wanting to center men. There's many other, she's right too. Like, I've run across women, lesbians in their 70s, who will just defend trans women to the hilt and think that trans women are the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I know 20-year-old lesbians that are like, nope. So it really isn't necessarily a generational divide. I'll stop it here. I'll pick up more talking about this topic and subject. There's other events and things that took place all the way back in the 70s that kind of repeat the same thing here, which is men come in and men want it about them, and a fight ensues. Men wanting to be in women's spaces is nothing new. This is not new. This was happening since the beginning. And this is an issue that's never been really resolved or solved since women started to come together and feminism started to become a grounding political movement, or just a way to live your life or understand yourself as a woman. Since this has started, since women have started to exclude men have wanted to come in, and this fight has ensued. And not just women against men. It's women against women too, because it's about, do you support patriarchy, or you do not support patriarchy? Do you center women? Do you not center women? Anyways, we'll continue to talk about it. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to getting into this and discussing it further. Feel free to reach out to me via email, which is in my information, my YouTube channel information. If you have a story or something you'd like to say that you don't want to put in the comments, feel free to reach out to me. I'm also on Instagram. Thanks, ladies, for listening, and have a great day, evening, night, whatever.